hired as the IOC's first director of marketing and broadcast. Not at the time seen perhaps as a career-enhancing move because the IOC was bankrupt and most people were writing the Olympic Games off.
Today, our guest is Michael Payne, Chairman CEO at Payne Sports Media Strategies. He now chairs Volleyball World and has just published Fast Tracks and Dark Deals, an odyssey of 50 years, brokering the deals that built the modern sports industry.
What do you think are the next area of opportunities, the next areas of potential and top potential for the industry of sport, right?
I will wager that within a decade or so, NFL will make a hostile takeover of world rugby. If it was a company, you'd do it tomorrow. You've now got athletes with 8 billion followers, and the content that they have total control over is their life story. Could the athlete become the single most important broadcaster?
Great. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Berkida Podcast. It is my pleasure today and really honored to be joined by Michael Payne, who is one of the most influential figures in the world of sports marketing, brand management, with all his experience across the IOC agencies before and also Formula One. But, perhaps best I let Michael give a little bit of an introduction on himself and some of his career, given that he spent so many years at the Olympic Committee and really played a central role in what the Olympics have become, how the Olympics have developed, and how, the industry of sports really, I would say, has born. Most recently, Michael has also published a very captivating book, Fast Tracks and Dark Deals. It's not exactly a short book, so I do recommend that if you look at it, you do it with a certain period of time, as you can see, definitely significant volume here. I would say also that it's important to consider how this book really goes into the background, the details behind the scenes of the politics, the commercialization, and the dynamics that shape the world of sport. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. And perhaps, if you don't mind, if you could give first a brief intro by yourself, and then we can take it from there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and great to be with you. I've spent my whole life and professional career in the business of sport. I actually started out as a ski racer on the professional circuit, on the freestyle ski circuit. No government support, so you had to go and find your own sponsorship and to pay for your hotels and airplanes. This was in the mid-late 70s, just as the sports marketing industry was beginning. And truth be told, I was a lot better at finding sponsors than I was at winning any of the competitions. And so I said, well, maybe there should be a career change here. And perhaps I should try and learn how this industry that was just beginning, the sports management, how it works. And I then began my career initially with the agencies that were involved at the very beginning, subsequently hired as the IOC's first director of marketing and broadcast. Not at the time seen perhaps as a career-enhancing move because the IOC was bankrupt and most people were writing the Olympic Games off, but proceeded to have the most incredible 20-year journey at the IOC with some incredible visionary leaders, from Juan Antonio Samaranch to Dick Pound. And as a small team, we turned the business model around to what you see today at the Olympics. Then moved to Formula One as Bernie Ecclestone's right hand, and had an amazing 15 years with Bernie, but also founding my own advisory group that went on to be at the forefront of brokering some of the industry's biggest deals, restructuring the sports program, up to today where I'm still very involved. One of my hats is as the chairman of Volleyball World, the joint venture between CVC Private Equity and the International Volleyball Federation. So I've had the privilege to, if you want, be at the forefront of the industry over the last 50 years. And I thought it would be interesting to tell the story, hence the book, Fast Track and Dark Deals.
Absolutely fascinating book. And I think for anybody like myself that, has been around the industry probably, and unfortunately, not as long as you, but, try to get as much experience as possible. Very, very much lots of anecdotes and lots of stories that, definitely kind of put some of the pieces together. But obviously, you were really there at the beginning. So I guess my first question really is, how did you sense that, the sport industry had the potential to become what it became? I mean, now, in a sense, I think every day we see launch of a new sports funds or some very specific funds, focus on women's sports, focus on sports tech, some very, very specific ones. So how did you sense that potential, and how much do you think the industry has really changed, since when you started?
Well, I mean, let's be very clear and honest. You know, when I joined the industry, it was at the very beginning, and I joined at the lowest rung of the ladder. I think I was being paid a junior account executive salary of about £3,500 a year, which, to put into perspective, I think was less than the toilet cleaner at that time. So I can't say that I necessarily had the vision to understand the potential of the industry, but there were one or two people who I worked for and worked with who clearly did. Perhaps, one of the most well-known names would be Mark McCormack, who founded the athlete management agency IMG. And he came to a very simple sort of conclusion. He was looking at the legendary golfers of the day who had the same profile as the top Hollywood actors. And yet Jack Nicklaus had just concluded a new endorsement deal with Heinz Ketchup for $500 a year and all the ketchup he could eat. And McCormack said, hang on, something's wrong with this pitcher. Why isn't he being remunerated and respected in the same way as a Hollywood star? And that was the founding of the vision, if you want, for athlete management.
Yeah.
And within a few years, the Nicklaus was earning hundreds of thousands of dollars. At the same time, there was a gentleman called Horst Dassler, the son of the founder of Adidas, who had his network throughout the sports world of the federations, the world governing body of football, of track and field. And he saw that these federations wanted to grow. At the time, he was the only, if you want, banker or revenue source. And he said, I can't sustain this. I need to find somebody else to help. And he turned to Coca-Cola and said, why don't you put some of your marketing dollars behind this? At the time, it was FIFA and the World Cup. And that, again, he was the bridge to extend the industry and open up the eyes of the big corporate multinationals. And so those perhaps were the two pillars that really helped launch the industry in the late 70s. I mean, but to be clear, it was the Wild West. There was no strategic playbook.
Yeah.
Secondly, it was tiny compared to what we know today. I mean, giving context, we're just about to start, the World Cup. FIFA reporting revenue of $11 billion. I was involved in the agency I was with was helping put together the first marketing strategy for the World Cup. This was in the late 70s. How many people do you think were at FIFA at the time? How many employees? 4.
Oh,
So the
wow.
negotiations were with 4 employees and a dog.
Incredible.
And so you look today at how important, the sports industry is to business, to society. It will make or break a media TV channel. It can make a brand. And, 50 years ago, you were negotiating deals, for $50,000. Today, it's $50 to $100 million a year.
And that's a ticket to the final.
Exactly. So I think if you were to go back and sadly both Mark McCormack and Horst Dassler, died many years ago, but I don't think even in their wildest dreams could they have envisaged that the industry would evolve to this level.
It's incredible again, like reading through some of the stories and also how you narrate the story of both McCormack and Dassler. So thank you very much for sharing data for novices like myself. But I guess one of the things that really comes through is how at the end of the day, through your experience, through your activities, both at ISL and then ultimately at the IOC, I guess, before moving to also Formula One. But in a sense, it really was the beginning of a new commercial framework for sport, right? And one of the things that really captured my attention is how focused you were on brand management and protecting the premium sports position. Do you want to talk, a little bit about that and why you saw so much importance on managing the brand and why some people did not really, understood perhaps that positioning and that importance?
The brand management in sport, I think has become fundamental to, if you want, creating the product and creating the reason why either fans follow or companies invest. But when, the Olympics, once we got over the initial hurdle of we're not going to be bankrupt, we've got the political agenda of boycotts established. Then turn to look at, okay, how do we protect what it is that makes us special, and how do we invest in that? And when we first started using terminology brand management in the, probably in the mid-90s, the reaction from most of the sort of suits within the sports organizations was, we're not a brand. Don't come here with that, commercial agenda and corrupt the Olympic ideal. We've been around 3,000 years. And we go, hang on a second, we're not a brand. But maybe there are some lessons that one could learn from companies like Coca-Cola about how do they protect their image? How do they understand what makes them special? And so slowly we didn't even use the word brand initially, because if I had, I would have been fired.
Yeah.
So you had a bit of a sort of cloak and dagger, but it really was to understand what creates the magic and what should be protected, what should be enhanced, what should be avoided. And remembering, there was no master strategic plan. Nobody had been there before us. So one was writing it making it up as we went along. And as such, you needed to really pay attention to, that you were not going to take some decision that was going to screw it all up. One example would be, there's no advertising in the stadium of the Olympics. Most people say, yeah, of course there is. There's advertising in all venues. And yet you say, hang on, stop, have a look at this video image. See, there's no advertising around the track or on the athlete. And everybody would go, my God, it's different. I never thought of it like that. Yes, now that you point it out to me, that is why the Olympics is different. It feels different. They couldn't necessarily put their finger on it, but they knew in their sixth sense that it was different. The athlete competing in front of the 5 rings. So over time, we began to understand how important brand management was, how important it was to protect the principles of what we believed we stood for, and to protect the exclusivity of our partners. And so, I tell stories in the book, which had never been told before, of one particularly famous partner, one of the biggest marketing budgets in the world, Mars Confectionery.
Yes.
And all they cared about was presence marketing and having their mascots jump out in front of the marathon runners so they could get a 3-second glimpse on TV. And we said, hang on a second, that's not what we're about. We're told, you don't understand marketing. I said, maybe you're right, but we understand what we want to make as special.
Yeah.
So if this isn't working, let's tear up the contract. And we tore up the contract in front of them and said, goodbye, get lost, which nobody had ever done to Mars before.
Yeah.
And I mean, they couldn't believe it. But it sent a message and signal that actually we were going to stand up and create and protect something that we believed in. And we're not going to sell out to the commercial interest, which when you don't have a lot of money in the bank, it's quite a brave move. The day there's enough money in the bank so you can decide how you want to play it out. But the reason there is money in the bank is because we operated if you want, zero tolerance in protecting, in the case of the Olympics, what makes it special.
And effectively, I guess, I think it's fair to say that's what allowed to create the Olympics as kind of the first luxury brand in the world of sports, right? So today, we just had recently the news that Gucci is going to sponsor a Formula One team, so I guess it tells us how, things are really evolved. I don't think, people, obviously LVMH has also become a Formula One sponsor, if I'm not mistaken, right? So, clearly things have moved quite a lot since. But the other thing, I guess, that I captured from the book that was very important was also the importance of having exceptional storytelling and how focused you were also on controlling that product, right? And in some case, I think also was quite interested to read, also given my background a little bit in sports broadcasting, how you wanted to buy back the whole archive of the Olympics, right? Which, in a sense, actually, I find it very interesting because one of the things I'm thinking about these days is how generally, even by big agencies, highlights have been seen as kind of not that important, but perhaps in the new world with where also younger demographics are going. Not only controlling archives, but also having the right highlights could be a lot more powerful and a lot more valuable than even the events.
I mean, storytelling is key. I mean, and let's be very clear, sport is in the entertainment business. And this day and age, people have more and more choice of how they want to spend their time, how they want to spend their savings in terms of what they want to follow. And it is all about stories, whether it's the uncertainty that sport is unique to provide, but increasingly it is about understanding your heritage and history, understanding who the athletes are, and what happens beyond the field of play. One of the most powerful assets of the Olympics is its history. And early in the 90s, I said, well, we need to control that history. And you can, well imagine when, the IOC was in the 60s or 70s, they were just glad to have a broadcaster turn up and cover the games. And maybe there was a little bit of a money tied into it. Nobody was paying any attention to copyright ownership of the image. And so, I went back and put a team together that went right back to 1900 to find the old imagery, the film outtakes, and over the course of 2 or 3 years, through archivists, negotiations, legal injunctions, blackmail, seduction, we brought the whole archive back. And I refer to blackmail there. I would sit down with the broadcasters as they wanted to renew their contract. And they would say, well, yeah, let's renew. And I said, not until you've agreed to hand over your archive. I said, well, that's blackmail. I said, yes. At the IOC, we think we're more entitled or need to protect that history because it's a history that belongs to humanity. And, we need to frankly get ahead of the game before Rupert Murdoch or Ted Turner buys up all the archives. And so we had this sort of race on between, these billionaires trying to hoover up all of the imagery and access to the history of sport. And, the IOC that was, some sports club playing well above its league. But we succeeded. I'm very proud of what was achieved there. And I think if we'd waited a couple of years, we wouldn't have won that battle.
Yes, yes. And I think it's a very interesting, principle that you talk about in the book, as you were just referencing, right? That sport ultimately is entertainment. And I guess, my question is, do you think that's what's been driving governments to, focus on, wanting to host the Olympics, wanting to host Formula One races, wanting to be part of it? And perhaps also is that, you think, what is driving so much private capital coming into the industry? Is there, recognition that ultimately it's not just about sports, but is about managing such an important piece of the entertainment pie?
Each of the different stakeholders have different agendas. If we start off with government, the hosting of major events is a massive national rebranding exercise. It's a massive national feel-good and respect and health attitude. And if you go back to 1988, when South Korea hosted the Olympic Games, when they'd won the rights to host the games in 1981, they were one of the poorest nations in the world. The image of South Korea was all tied up to the Korean War, and the reference made in Korea was a showcase of cheap product, copycat product, didn't work, poor quality.
Yeah.
They staged the Olympic Games and overnight transformed the image of the country. The modern, dynamic, and you look at Korea today in terms of their perspective on innovation, engineering, it's at the forefront, one of the most respected nations in the world. You can take that right back to 1988 and the staging of the Games in South Korea. 4 years later, Barcelona totally transformed the image and business outlook of Spain's second city into making it one of the most dynamic tourism capitals in the world, to the extent that today the biggest problem they face now is over-tourism.
Yeah.
You go to China in 2008 and it was their coming out party onto the world stage. So those were rebranding exercises. It was the same with Formula One. And I was responsible for taking the Formula One to Russia. We said, what do you want to do after the Olympic Games?
story there.
Sochi.
Quite a story in the book on how that came about.
Well, that's probably a showcase of Bernie Ecclestone negotiating techniques.
I'm not saying that if you don't sign the contract. Oh, it's 700 pages. Like, wow.
No, I mean, I had never met anybody with the balls of steel in a negotiation in the way that Bernie Ecclestone. I mean, legendary, different league, and that I'd spent a couple of years trying to put this deal together of Formula One in Russia. And it starts out with Bernie going, I don't want to go to Sochi. It's a bloody dump. I want to go to Moscow or St. Petersburg. And I said, well, Bernie, I mean, all due respect, you've been trying to go to Moscow or St. Petersburg for 30 years. There's a very good reason you've not gone. They won't pay. If you want to be paid, we're going to Sochi. And I'll wager that after $50 billion investment from the Olympics, maybe it's not such a dump. And you sort of go off grumbling. Anyway, things, were not moving very quickly. And I think Bernie, had no confidence it was going to come together. I walk into the office one day and, Bernie says, they want me to go to Sochi at the end of the week and meet Putin to negotiate the contract. I thought, amazing, this is back on. I'm not going. Why, Bernie? Do I look stupid? And obviously you got to be careful answering that question to your boss. And he said, their problem, they told Putin I was going to come. If they sent the contract back signed, I will go. Otherwise, I'm not getting on the plane. I said, but Bernie, it's a $500 million contract. It's hundreds of pages long. There needs to be a little discussion. I'm not going. 3 hours later, the contract comes back, signed. Not a comma is changed. Bernie gets on the plane, meets Putin. They spend 2 hours together and not a word about the contract. And at the end of the meeting, Putin picks up the phone on some poor oligarch and gives him the good news that he's the newest sponsor of Formula One at $500 million. I mean, that's how some of these deals and everything came together. I mean, but that for Russia was all about stepping up on the world stage after the Olympics. At another completely opposite end of the spectrum was how we brought Formula One to Singapore. And, that was over some good wine at a dinner with the ministers, and they were brainstorming how they wanted to change the image of Singapore and make it a little bit more fun and edgy and not so cold. And what about the idea of hosting a golf tournament or a tennis tournament? And I said, yeah, I mean, you can do that, but is that going to change the image of Singapore? I'm not sure. And by about the second or third bottle of wine, I said, why don't you do a street race at night? And it literally was the wine talking.
Right.
And the ministers will say, oh, don't be so stupid. Crazy idea. And it was a crazy idea. But 3 months later in Parliament, when they're having a discussion about changing the image, what was that crazy idea of Payne's? And 6 months later, we got a street race at nighttime in Singapore.
It's one of the appointments to not to miss now in the Formula One race calendars.
But it has a major contribution in changing or evolving the image of the country.
Yes.
And it's reinforced Singapore as a business hub for exactly the reason you now said, is one of the must go to places. So that's the story of the governments. Again, if you look at the corporate branding, how did Samsung transform itself from an after-ran that was a copycat brand and getting instant recognition and credibility? And this was the deal we did, for the Olympics. At the time they were acquired on wireless communications, they were not even in the top 10 brands. Within 3 years, they're number 2. Now, obviously, the product's got to work, but they could have thrown no amount of advertising dollar that would have changed it at the speed that the Olympic Association drove that brand at supersonic speed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And look, these are, some of the stories that people obviously can read through your book. And that's why I definitely highly recommend it to anybody that wants to learn about the history and the future also of the world of sport. But one of the, at least for me, most fascinating thread is also your history with Formula One. And actually, that's where we first met. I have a little non-mention, I guess, in the book when you talk about the myriads of bankers that you met through your work in with CVC around that IPO, because I was also, back in the days, I think I remember very well, when we were working on drafting the industry section of the IPO prospectus. Obviously never saw the light of the day, although, it definitely helped secure investments from the likes of Gordon Reed, BlackRock, and Norges, because that was one of the things that was distributed to them to get comfortable with the story. But in any event, like Formula One, an industry created by Bernie, and during one of the due diligence session I had, I still remember seeing in the paddock club, Bernie, who at the time must have already been in his 80s, by the way, moving chairs because he said, "Oh, this table is too close to each other. There is one too many chairs in this table." So I think you have some other handouts like this in the book about the attention to detail of Bernie. But what can you tell us about why Bernie Ecclestone was such a transformative figure? How much did he really symbolize Formula One, the understanding of entertainment? Such a powerful figure, but also such a kingmaker, right? What can you share about your experience with Formula One that perhaps it's really different?
Well, Bernie, although he was coming from within the sport because he was, a failed racing driver and then a quite successful team manager. But everybody was focused, if you want, inwards on let's go racing. Nobody was focused on outwards in terms of what does this look like? How do we begin to put some structure together and create the strategic partnerships that can really drive the sport? And Bernie, a bit like Mark McCormack with his Hollywood connection, Bernie was one of the first to understand the potential of Formula One as great TV entertainment. And let's remember back then, most countries only had one TV station, maybe two. So there was no real competitive dynamic in the market, but they were looking for great content. And the Formula One, image of, daredevil, life and death, racing and, Monaco and the glamour was a great story. But, one weekend the race was at 2:00. The next weekend it might have been at 4:00. The weekend after, the drivers would turn up and not even know if there would be petrol available for their cars. And so Bernie said, well, hang on, somebody needs to represent this group and put a little bit of structure. And they were very happy to let Bernie take the lead because they were busy racing. And Bernie said, hang on, there's a bigger opportunity and a bigger play here. And, over, the subsequent, 2 decades, Bernie is the ultimate poker player, the ultimate gambler. He, put everything on black in the roulette table or however you want to, describe it, and, pieced it together with unbelievable, vision and absolute dictatorial control. And, for not to get into a debate about, the pros and cons of the politics of between dictatorship and democracy, but you've got 10, 12 Formula One teams, and it's not for nothing that, there's books that have been written about it called the Piranha Club, that they want to just eat each other alive. So they're not going to work and cooperate together. We take on the Olympic front, to get 200 countries to turn up, sign up to the same strategy, marketing program, back between the communists, the Americans, it required single-handed dictatorship with vision. Because if you sit around the table, having a democracy discussion, you'll get 12 different ideas from the teams or 200 different ideas from the countries. It ain't going to happen. So, and there were remarkable similarities between Bernie and Samaranch. And they, became good friends and respected and trusted each other for, what they achieved. And as I said, it's absolute clear vision, real strategic leadership, total control, and absolute attention to detail. And that was the recurring profile across any one of, the early visionary leaders. And, I was unbelievably, privileged to, be tutored by each of them, as we built the industry.
Absolutely. And what incredible businesses they both built, basically, right? If I can quote them, so I guess, because one, I guess, the things that we are seeing at the moment is so much influx that we were saying, private capital into this world of sport. And I guess, if I can ask you, what do you think it's still the most misunderstood piece of the sports puzzle by investors that look at the world of sport?
That's a great question. The sports world is not per se, founded on the same commercial operating principles the business world is. A lot of the sports world is either on one end of the spectrum, driven by volunteers. It's their hobby, it's their passion. This is where they devote all of their energy and time with all the best intentions, but not necessarily understanding, the business model that the business has to work. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got, the billionaire owners who buy a team as much as a hobby, as a toy.
Yeah.
And then you've got the private equities that are coming in and say, well, there's this great potential and opportunity here, but not always understanding how, the sport works. So, one that I'm particularly close to is with CVC, and their investment in volleyball has been very similar, say, to the investment in Formula One, because you've got a single, united, clear authority and control, and can make things happen fast and be very successful. On the other hand, you look at CVC's, move with rugby, which is many different parts, many different clubs, many different owners. It's not so simple to get them all aligned around a single strategy on the same page. So that's probably maybe the biggest wake-up call that the private equity, all the sovereign wealth funds, we look at what's happening with LIV Golf at the moment, that yes, sport has a tremendous potential, and we're still only, I'm not saying scratching the surface, we're well down the journey, but there's still a lot of potential left. But at the same time, it doesn't all operate, if you want, the normal business protocols of the day. And, worked with many of the great, business leaders. And, they come and look at the sports world absolutely fascinated as to how do you get all these countries aligned? How do you get all these governments aligned? Because sport's often the only vehicle that can achieve that. And they look and say, there's lessons that we at the top end of business can take on board here in terms of dealing with the Chinese, government perspective. And likewise, there's many important lessons that sports world needs to take from business.
It's absolutely, fair and super, so thank you very much for sharing that perspective. And for such an interesting conversation, really, which perhaps leads me to, a final question, really, and you talk a little bit also again, towards the end of your book, but also for the benefits of, who is listening to the podcast, what do you think are the next area of opportunities, the next areas of potential, untapped potential for the industry of sport, right? There is so much focus, women's sports, sports tech, we were debating some of this before. What do you think people should go in the industry?
The final chapter of the book, looks at the future, where I say, well, I hope you've enjoyed this journey over the last 50 years. What does the next 50 years have in hold? And I sort of proceed to make a number of predictions, very provocative, but designed to get people thinking.
Yes.
And it ranges from, take the area of sports governance, and, at the structure of international sport with international federations has not fundamentally changed over the last century. Doesn't mean it's not going to change radically in the years to come. And to illustrate that, I said, I will wager that within a decade or so, NFL will make a hostile takeover of world rugby.
Yes.
Because if it was a company, you'd do it tomorrow. Because NFL wants to roll out worldwide, not to replace rugby, but to own it as a sister company and to build all the complementary opportunities from the club level, the grassroots, the development, through to, the access to key markets. You would transform NFL overnight. Rugby doesn't have a lot of money. It would be a no-brainer.
Yeah.
I go forward to broadcasting and say, well, who will the future broadcasters be? Will it be the networks that we know? Will it be the new tech companies that are all starting to dip their toe in the water? Will it be some company we've never heard of yet? 50 years, remember, long time.
Yeah.
Or will it be somebody who we all know very well? The athlete. Is the athlete becoming so powerful on his own social media, where you've now got athletes with 8 billion followers, and the content that they have total control over is their life story, what happens off the field of play, who their family is, what the name of the dog is, and that content, not to replace the actual field of play sports content, but it's becoming as important in the storytelling, particularly with the younger generation. Are you going to have the athlete saying, sure, I'll compete in that event, but I want access to the imagery in the field of play to complement my life story? So could the athlete become the single most important broadcaster? Because the technology's there. And then you get into how AI is going to change every single aspect of sport, how sports will evolve. And one of the stories in the book was looking at one of the oldest sports on the Olympic program, modern pentathlon. It's thrown off the Olympics. I am persuaded, I won't use the word blackmail because that would be unfair. I was persuaded in a negotiation with Prince Albert in Monaco, who is the honorary president of modern pentathlon, to save the sport. I said, I have no idea how to save it. He said, but I trust you that you will find a way to save it. And so I ended up with a group of friends together, and we restructured the sport by basically throwing out equestrian and replacing it with ninja warriors. Now, before everybody goes, what the hell are you talking about? Modern pentathlon was the military sport founded at the turn of the 20th century of the perfect traits of a military officer: to be able to run, swim, ride, fight, shoot. Well, last time I checked, military officers are not going into battle on a horse anymore, but they are training you look at the elite warriors, they are training in extreme obstacle courses. So evolve the sport. And we now have modern pentathlon back on the program, and arguably in Los Angeles with Ninja Warrior obstacle racing could well be one of the hits.
Absolutely. These are some of the anecdotes for which, I suggest everybody really interested in the world of sports should be reading Fast Track and Dark Deals. And Michael, I think we could be going on forever, but this has been such a, really enlightening, interesting, phenomenal conversation. I really wanted to thank you for taking the time to speak to me on the Berkida podcast, and look forward to continue the conversation. And I'm sure, listeners will find this incredibly fascinating as well. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, great pleasure to be with you. And I mean, most important of all is that, people just enjoy the story. It is actually nonfiction, although many people would think of it has to be fiction, but it's all true. And how this industry that in one way or another touches everybody, how it has evolved and what the future has. So thank you for having me on your podcast.
Thank you, Michael.